What we need is to destroy the false self so that the true self can live. Thomas Merton. Throughout my journey of self-discovery, one of the ideas that has intrigued me the most is that of the ego and the importance of its death. The ego, this part of us that we often associate with our identity and the way we present ourselves to the world, is a complex and multifaceted construct. It is shaped by our experiences, beliefs, fears, and desires. The ego is what differentiates us from others, but it is also what binds us to our limitations, to the illusions about who we truly are, and to the way we perceive the world around us. When I began to reflect more deeply on the idea of the death of the ego, I realized that this death is not something literal or physical, but rather a profound internal transformation. The death of the ego refers to the process of transcending the barriers that the ego builds, allowing us to access a more authentic and pure version of ourselves. This concept appears in various philosophical and spiritual traditions, all emphasizing the need to go beyond the ego to reach a higher state of consciousness, true inner peace, and a deeper connection with the universe. However, the idea of the death of the ego can seem frightening at first glance. After all, the ego is what gives us a sense of identity and separation. It is, in a way, an armor we create to protect ourselves from the uncertainties and vulnerabilities of life. But at the same time, this armor can become a prison, preventing us from growing and truly connecting with the world and others. That is why the death of the ego is so essential. It frees us from these chains and allows us to experience life in a more expansive and fulfilling way. In this video, I want to explore what it really means to kill the ego. We will talk about how this idea has been approached by different philosophies and spiritual traditions, and why it is seen as a crucial step on the path to self-knowledge and personal fulfillment. But before we delve into these approaches, it is important to understand that the process of the death of the ego is not something that happens quickly or easily. It is a journey that requires courage, self-compassion, and above all, a willingness to face our own shadows. But before we continue, I would like to invite you to subscribe to my channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Also, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends and family, and leave a comment below. Your support is very important to me. Throughout my journey of self-discovery, I realized that the concept of the ego and its eventual death is a recurring theme in many philosophical and spiritual traditions around the world. The ego, this mental construct that fuels the notion of a separate and individual self, has been the subject of intense reflection by philosophers, mystics, and psychologists. The process of questioning, confronting, and eventually transcending the ego is seen as an essential step toward reaching a deeper state of consciousness and fulfillment. One of the traditions that centrally addresses the idea of the death of the ego is Buddhism. In Buddhism, the ego is often described as an illusion, a mental construct that creates the false perception of a self, separate and distinct from the rest of the universe. The teachings of Buddha emphasize that attachment to this illusion is the primary source of human suffering. For Buddhists, the death of the ego does not mean the annihilation of the self, but the dissolution of this illusion, allowing the person to experience the state of Nirvana, a consciousness where the self merges with the totality of existence, free from the shackles of desire, fear, and ignorance. In the field of psychology, especially in the work of Carl Jung, the ego is seen somewhat differently. Jung did not view the ego as something to be destroyed, but rather as a necessary part of the psyche that needs to be integrated into the self, the deeper center of personality. For Jung, the process of individuation involves the death of the ego as a form of transformation, where the individual transcends the superficial and limited identity of the ego, to connect with a broader and deeper dimension of their own psyche. It is in this process of integration that one can find a true unification between the conscious and unconscious, leading to a more fulfilling and authentic life. Another interesting perspective comes from Western mysticism, where the death of the ego is often described as a process of spiritual purification. Christian mystics, for example, speak of the dark night of the soul, a period of intense spiritual trial where the individual is confronted with desolation and despair, only to emerge in a state of union with the divine. Here, the death of the ego is seen as a necessary passage for spiritual renewal, where the ego, with its worldly concerns and limitations, is left behind, allowing the person to connect with a higher spiritual reality. In Taoism, a Chinese philosophical and spiritual tradition, the ego is approached in an even more subtle way. Taoism emphasizes harmony with the Tao, the fundamental principle that governs the universe. For Taoists, the ego is one of the barriers that prevent the natural flow of life. The practice of Wu Wei, or action without effort, is a path to transcending the ego, where the person learns to act in harmony with the natural flow of things, without the interference of selfish ambitions and desires. In Taoism, the death of the ego is less of a battle and more of a process of detachment and alignment with the natural order of the cosmos. These various philosophical perspectives lead me to reflect on how the concept of the death of the ego can be understood and applied in different ways, depending on the cultural and spiritual context. However, they all share the view that the ego, in its unrefined form, is a limitation that prevents us from reaching a higher state of existence. The transcendence of the ego, whether through meditation, psychological individuation, spiritual purification, or harmonization with the Tao, is seen as an essential journey for those who seek a deeper, more authentic, and connected life. Considering these approaches, I understand that the death of the ego is not about rejecting our individuality, but about transcending the limitations that the ego imposes on us. It is a process of expanding consciousness, where we stop identifying with our masks and illusions to approach a more authentic and profound reality. This transformation, though challenging, is also deeply liberating, as it allows us to live according to our true nature, in harmony with ourselves and with the universe. Throughout my journey of self-knowledge, the concept of the death of the ego has presented itself not just as a distant philosophical idea, but as a real and transformative experience that manifests at various stages of life. At first, the idea of letting the ego die seemed frightening to me, almost as if I were being challenged to give up an essential part of who I am. However, as I began to explore more deeply what it really means to transcend the ego, I realized that this process is not a loss, but a liberation. I remember specific moments in my life where the ego showed itself as a dominant force, fueling my sense of identity based on external achievements, social recognition, and constant comparison with others. The ego, in its competitive and defensive nature, led me to seek validation outside of myself, creating an endless cycle of desire and dissatisfaction. It was as if I was always chasing something that, deep down, could never truly satisfy my deepest needs. It was at this point that I began to realize the limitations of the ego. It offered me a sense of identity and purpose, but at the same time, it kept me trapped in patterns of thought and behavior that distanced me from a true understanding of myself. Every time the ego felt threatened, whether by criticism, rejection, or failure, I reacted defensively, trying to protect an image of myself that in reality was fragile and built on illusions. The first time I experienced a death of the ego was during a period of great personal challenge. Facing a crisis that shook my self-confidence and questioned everything I thought I was, I was forced to confront my own vulnerabilities. In this process, I realized that much of the suffering I was experiencing came from my attachment to a constructed identity, a version of myself that I believed to be true, but which in reality was just a mask I wore to navigate the world. This period was painful, but also incredibly revealing. As I let go of the layers of the ego, I began to see who I really was behind the masks. Someone who didn't need to define themselves by achievements, status, or the approval of others. This revelation was both frightening and liberating. I was facing a more authentic version of myself, a version that was no longer tied to external expectations or the illusions of the ego. The death of the ego did not happen all at once, but it was a gradual process of detachment and rediscovery. Each time I managed to release a part of my ego, I felt lighter, more at peace, more connected with a sense of being that did not depend on external factors. I began to understand that the ego, in its essence, is a tool, useful for navigating the material world, but not the center of my existence. By putting the ego in its proper place, I was able to make room for a more expansive way of being, where what mattered was not what I possessed or how I was seen by others, but the depth of my experiences and the authenticity with which I lived my life. This personal reflection led me to appreciate the importance of the process of the death of the ego as an essential part of spiritual and emotional growth. It is not about destroying the ego, but about transforming it, allowing it to become a servant of my true nature, rather than a tyrant that keeps me imprisoned by my own illusions. At each stage of this journey, I realized that by letting the ego die, I take one step closer to living fully and in harmony with my deepest self. Today, I see the death of the ego as a continuous practice, a constant dance between attachment and detachment, between illusion and truth. And while this process is never easy, it is undoubtedly one of the most enriching experiences we can have. By transcending the ego, we can finally access a life of authenticity, freedom, and genuine connection, not just with ourselves, but with everyone around us. By letting the ego die, we are not losing anything. We are, in fact, making space for something much greater, a deeper connection with our true self and with the universe around us. I hope this reflection has inspired you to look within yourself with more honesty and to question the parts of your ego that may still be in control. Now, I invite you to continue this journey, to reflect on the role of the ego in your own life, and to explore what it means to live beyond it. Thank you very much for accompanying me this far. Please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to like the video, share it with friends and family, and leave a comment. Your support is essential to keep me motivated to bring more valuable content to our community. Until next time,